Good morning and welcome back. This is World Talks coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Salia Strzemska. Donald Trump returned to the White House promising to put America first, to end wars, avoid new ones, and use America's economic and political leverage to secure better deals. But more than a year and a half into his second term, the U.S. is locked in a prolonged conflict with Iran, while just the past several days have brought new tensions with South Korea and a fresh trade confrontation with Canada. So is Trump reshaping America's relationship around the world or risking leaving Washington more isolated? To discuss this, I'm joined by Joshua Burgin, the founder of the Alliance for Global Security. Good morning, Joshua. Good to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Sally. Good to be with you.
So let's start with Canada. Prime Minister Mark Carney says last-minute changes to the U.S. terms were unfair and called into question the trustworthiness of any deal. What does the collapse of these talks tell us about the state of the U.S.-Canada relationship, traditionally one of Washington's closest allies?
So as we watch these things, it's interesting in my mind to watch what's happening in the news versus we weren't there. I am not deeply concerned about the longevity and the strength of the U.S.-Canada relationship. But I do think it's quite clear right now that some of the leading figureheads in Washington and Ottawa don't particularly like each other very much. To that end, I think we are seeing these last-minute sort of aborts of what was looking like something on a positive glide path, and now it's not. Do I think this is permanent? I do not. Do I think it creates for good television at the moment? Yes, I do.
Okay, but now Canada is promising to retaliate dollar for dollar, but that retaliation will raise costs at home, obviously. So how much economic pain can Canada realistically absorb because it is so dependent on the U.S. market?
There's a high degree of interdependence on both sides. So while, yes, the U.S. is a bigger market, there will be pain felt on both sides. And frankly speaking, if we look at it rationally, both sides are basically handing money to each other that are going in the form of tariffs or taxes that don't need to be. I'm convinced that this will settle in some time. Is it in 6 weeks? Is it in 6 months? I don't know, but it's not rational for these two near adjacent countries to be engaging in the way that they currently are. Human nature is fully at play. And you have an administration, Trump, who you've already highlighted in the previous segment and now, who deeply believes that tariffs are a legitimate way or a better way even than what has been previously in the U.S.-led globalism or trade without costs or barriers. We will see in time, and we'll see what gets sustained in future administrations and even past this next election cycle in the U.S.
So let's turn to Iran now. The 60-day deadline for the U.S. and Iran to reach a permanent agreement has now expired with no deal, obviously. Now, Trump says Tehran wants an agreement, but Washington is instead turning to even greater economic pressure on a country that has already been under extensive sanctions for years. So what happens now? I mean, is there still a realistic path back to negotiations, or are we looking at renewed hostilities or a prolonged period of limbo?
We've seen senior figureheads on record in the media effectively saying from Iran that it's better for them to wait it out. It's better for them to wait through the congressional elections. It is better even for them to wait through to perhaps a future president. And you have a regime there that has built itself on being decentralized, on being incredibly resistant to the near abroad, to the world more broadly, including the West. I see this as a regime that many leaders, both Europeans and Americans, had kicked the can down the road. For all of the faults we can point to with the current administration's approach, we have seen a dialing down of their proxy conflicts. We've seen a dialing down of their ability to project power. And frankly, Iran is a bad actor, and we should always keep that center stage. I don't see this resolving in any amicable way fully for at least another 12 to 18 months. That's my view. It could be 24. Every bit of the coverage right now is necessary in terms of media, but is relatively meaningless. And I think that's kind of the moment we're in. We have to watch and see.
Okay, but according to some recent reports, the US and its Gulf allies have managed to keep millions of barrels of oil moving despite Iran's pressure on the Strait of Hormuz. So does that weaken one of Tehran's most important bargaining chips?
Absolutely. And every month that goes by, as you see the Saudis and the Emiratis and others building pipelines away from the strait, I'm frankly kind of surprised there's been no talk of putting in a canal for further back along the strait. The broad point is that every month that goes by, these Gulf shippers are able to find ways around the dependence on the strait, around Iran's ability to project power and constraint. And frankly, it's not really in their interest. So while Trump is correct to say they want a deal, and I think Iran would like to avoid the pain, Iran is also not willing to give up the thing that it wants most, which is the ability to have nuclear weapons, which as we see this regime, I think this is dreadful. It would be dreadful for the world for Iran to get a nuclear weapon. I think it's been reprehensible for past leadership to avoid that question for so long. And while, yes, I can sit on the sidelines like every other armchair quarterback and point to what's wrong with the Trump administration's approach, they took action in a place that probably needed action 10 years ago or more.
But what about optics back at home? How important is this war for Trump?
He would love to be able to say, hey, I've won, this is done. I'm sure he wants that deal. Does this affect him profoundly in the midterm elections? Gas prices at the pump may, but we've been here many times before. For the past 20 years, I've seen prices flirt with $4 before, routinely sit above $3. It was the administration's policies that allowed it to dip down below, and then now that the conflict has pushed it back up. I don't think the president's going to suffer like every other president in his final term, a sort of swing in the congressional and headwinds for any Republican following him in the presidential cycle of 2028. Is this meaningful? The majority of Americans don't have a passport, and if they do have a passport, they've been to one European country. I don't think that the vast majority of Americans are paying too close attention to what's happening in Iran. Not saying that none are. I'm just saying I don't think it's as big a factor as you may suggest it is today.
I also wanted to talk about the US-Israeli relationship as it seems to be changing. So to start, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected Donald Trump's 15-point plan for Gaza. In a separate development, we've just seen some unusual criticism of Israeli settlers from Washington. So I'll just explain that U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, publicly condemned settlers who surrounded Palestinian homes in the West Bank in the village of Qusra and warned that those responsible could face U.S. sanctions and a travel ban possibly. So this is unusual because Huckabee has long been a staunch supporter of Israel. So how significant is this shift in tone? And just to add, this comes as some influential voices on the American right are becoming increasingly critical of some aspects of Israeli policy.
To your point, it is shocking to see Huckabee in this posture. I think the current tone coming out of Washington, specifically the White House, is a reflection of a breakage of trust or some animosity right now between Trump and Netanyahu. It is worth noting that Netanyahu has been in power for a very long time. Maybe, I'm sure Israel itself is thinking about what that future looks like. I don't see this as a major shift between the U.S. and Israel. I see this as a personality conflict or a personal conflict now between Netanyahu and the President of the United States. Where this goes, and to your point, there are voices on the right that are increasingly becoming anti-Israel, or as some would say, anti-Semitic. It is a bit of a tone shift that at times past Israel had bipartisan support across both polities. Now you have the fringe of the left and the fringe of the right increasingly at odds with Israel, and a center will need to hold if that alliance is going to continue. There are many reasons for our strongest ally in the Middle East to continue to have strong ties to Washington. They've certainly invested for decades, but it is an interesting development on both the left and the right. And the administration's posture right now reflects a profound dissatisfaction with Netanyahu.
And just to add, elections are coming up in Israel in October. What is the likely outcome and how will it shape the US-Israel relationship?
You know, I've come to never underestimate the ability of Likud to navigate its way past strong headwinds and other issues. I've not tracked what's happening in the Israeli elections as close as I am the U.S. elections. Obviously, as I've already touched on, I would expect probably the Republicans will lose majority in the United States House. That's almost a given. In the U.S. Senate, it is much more complex for them, and they've had a few missteps on various Senate races. So I don't think that happens there. But nevertheless, I think we're going to see gridlock even more so than we have with the narrow majorities in the U.S. House.
Now, on a different note, Joshua, looking at Trump's relationship with some of its traditional allies, I have to ask about South Korea, because just a week ago, in a rather bizarre move, Trump ordered the Pentagon to scale back military exercises with South Korea, in part because Seoul refused to support U.S. campaign against Iran. So how do you understand that decision?
So it's fascinating. I'm glad you've asked about this. I've been watching now for a number of months, as we've seen, if you've watched the opinion headlines or the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, there have been numerous pieces published in recent months covering the idea that South Korea was not necessarily allowing market access for U.S. companies, was being somehow resistant to U.S. trade. There has been some brewing under the surface contest now for a while, and I view what's happened more recently with Trump's bizarre announcements and so forth to be continuation of that. Whether the South Koreans are paying attention to those editorial pages, aware that some of those voices are, if not close to the Trump administration, certainly quite proximate and reflecting an attitude within the administration, I can't say. But there is some tension between Seoul and Washington right now, and I'm not convinced that it's purely on military exercises, but perhaps more on economics and trade access, etc. That's my interpretation of Trump's, as you've already put it, very odd sort of tweet.
But what would you say to an argument that Trump is effectively making American security commitments conditional on allies supporting U.S. policy elsewhere? And what does it mean for other allies, such as NATO?
So I think Trump would argue, and I can see some merits in this, that the deal that has existed, that the American engagement around the world, around security, has long been, we will subsidize you on trade. We will enable your countries to be strong on trade. We will not challenge what would normally be unfair practices in interest of serving our trade, our defense alliance. And the era of Trump, that has ended, particularly on Europe. Russia's attack on Ukraine in 2022 signaled the nail in the coffin of the Cold War. No longer was Washington at any level, whether the Trump administration or another, concerned that Russia could push its way to the Atlantic and control the Atlantic. If it couldn't control what was previously a province or a state of the Soviet Union, after 2 to 3 years, clearly Washington could offload and demand effectively that Europe take responsibility for its own territory. This said, Europe has reacted strongly to this and is only now in the last year and a half or so really come to the table on defense. And increasingly so, there's still question marks around how trade is all going to line out. Again, the old deal in which the U.S. would accept unfavorable terms on economics and trade in order to make sure that the defense posture was great. That era has come to an end, and I don't think that leadership around the world, even our allies, have fully come to terms with that.
Joshua Burgin, founder of the Alliance for Global Security, thank you so very much for joining us this morning. Much appreciated. And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.